I was 39 years old the first time I understood what my father meant when he told me that numbers don't lie, only people do. He said it to me 100 times growing up, usually with a red pen in his hand and a stack of chemistry tests on the kitchen table. He taught high school chemistry in Willow Creek, North Carolina for 31 years, and he graded every single paper with the same fountain pen, a slim brass-capped Waterman his own father had given him. When he died, he left me that pen in a small wooden box, along with a letter I still hadn't opened. I kept the pen in the pocket of my cardigan most days. Not because I needed it, because it reminded me where I came from. On the day Korbin and I closed on the house on Larkspur Lane, I had that pen in my pocket, and I remember thinking my father would have liked this house. 2 stories, white with black shutters, a wraparound porch, and a garden bed out back I'd already mapped in my head for tomatoes and hydrangeas. I put down most of the money myself. An inheritance. 31 years of a teacher's salary, saved carefully, handed to me the way my father handed me everything, quietly, and with instructions. Korbin signed his name next to mine at the closing table, and when he looked up at me, he had that smile. The one that made me forget, 12 years ago, that I was still grieving my father when I met him. He had a way of showing up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right thing to say. "We did it," he said. "We did," I said, and I believed it completely. I need to back up though, because the house isn't where this starts. It starts with what I do for a living, and why that matters. I've been an accountant for 16 years, the last 9 at a small firm in Willow Creek that handles mostly local businesses and a handful of trusts. My job is numbers. Reconciling them, checking them, catching the one line that doesn't add up when everyone else has stopped looking. My father used to say I got that from him, the habit of reading everything twice before I believed it. I never thought that habit would end up saving my life. Korbin worked in commercial insurance, the kind of job where he wore a tie he didn't like and complained about his commute. He was easy to love in the ordinary ways. He remembered my coffee order. He called his mother every Sunday. He cried at my father's funeral even though he'd only met him twice. That last part mattered to me more than I ever said out loud. His mother, Morgause, was harder to love, but I tried. She had a way of walking into a room like she already owned it, and a voice that could sound warm and cutting in the same sentence. At our wedding, she'd hugged me and said, "Well, Korbin certainly has a type," and smiled the whole time she said it, so that I spent a full year wondering if I'd imagined the edge in it. I hadn't imagined it. I know that now. But on the day we closed on that house, none of that mattered yet. I stood in the empty living room after the paperwork was signed, sunlight coming through bare windows, and Korbin wrapped his arms around me from behind. 12 years, he said. And we finally have a real house. I leaned back against him and looked at that empty room, and thought about my father. About the check he'd left me. About the letter still sealed in its box on my dresser. I thought I would open it eventually. When I was ready. I had no idea how soon I would need to be. What I didn't understand yet was how much Korbin's mother had already decided about that house. We moved in over the following week, boxes lining the hallway, the smell of fresh paint still hanging in every room. Korbin took charge of the financial paperwork almost immediately. The mortgage documents, the insurance binder, the folder of receipts from the movers. "It's just easier this way," he said, when I offered to help sort it. "You've got enough on your plate with the tax season crowd at work." I let him have it. That's the part one still think about. I let him have it because it seemed like love. A husband taking one more thing off my shoulders. And not what it actually was, which was a man quietly building a habit of being the only one who knew where everything sat. Morgause came by almost every day that first week, always under the same reason. Helping us settle in. She had opinions about where the sectional should go, about the fireplace mantel, about the color I'd chosen for the guest room, which she called a bit much, with a small laugh that made it hard to argue without sounding thin-skinned. I want to be fair to her here, because my father taught me that too. That people are rarely all one thing. There was a morning that first week when I dropped a box of my father's old chemistry textbooks on the porch steps. and everything spilled across the wet concrete. Morgause was the one who came outside first. She got down on her knees in her good slacks and helped me gather every soaked page without a word of complaint. And when we were done, she sat back on her heels and said, "My own mother taught chemistry too. Different era. Different world for a woman to do that." Then she squeezed my hand, just once, and went back inside. That's the moment I would think about later, when everything else had gone cold between us. That's the moment that made the rest of it so hard to see coming. Korbin had moments like that too. The Tuesday I came home from work exhausted, he'd already made dinner and drawn a bath and put on the record my father used to play on Sunday mornings, because I'd mentioned once, months earlier, that I missed the sound of it. He remembered things like that. Small things. He remembered them so well that it never once occurred to me to wonder what he did with everything else he noticed. By the end of that first week, I had unpacked the box with my father's pen and set it on my nightstand, next to the letter I still hadn't opened. I told myself I'd get to it once the house felt like home. I want to tell you that nothing felt wrong yet. That would be true mostly. But there was a Thursday evening near the end of that week, when I came downstairs for a glass of water and heard Korbin on the phone in the kitchen, his voice pitched low in a way I didn't recognize. "No, not yet," he was saying. "She's still getting settled. Give it some time." He hung up before I reached the doorway. When I asked who it was, he said work, and smiled, and reached for the wine glass on the counter, and I believed him because I had no reason yet not to. I went back upstairs and picked up my father's pen off the nightstand, and turned it over in my hand for a while before I set it back down. I didn't know yet what I would end up doing with that pen. I only knew in some quiet, unexamined place that I was glad I still had it. The thing about small wrongness is that it never announces itself. I noticed it in pieces, the way you notice a draft in an old house. First as nothing, then as something you've simply gotten used to, and only much later as something worth tracing back to its source. It started with the mail. Morgause had taken to arriving most afternoons around 4, always with some reason. A casserole dish she needed back. A paint swatch she wanted to show us against the living room wall in real light. And nearly every time, I'd pull into the driveway to find her already at the mailbox at the end of Larkspur Lane, sorting through the stack before I'd even parked. "Bills mostly," she'd say, handing me a thin stack that never quite matched the thickness of what I remembered our mailbox usually holding. "I like to save you the walk." I thanked her every time. It seemed like kindness. My father used to say that most people who take something from you don't take it by force. They take it by convenience, one small favor at a time, until the favor becomes the arrangement. I didn't think of that saying once during those weeks. I think of it constantly now. Korbin, for his part, had become the sole keeper of every folder in the house. Insurance, mortgage statements, the receipts from the movers, all of it lived in an accordion file in his home office. And when I asked once if I could look through it, just to understand where we stood financially, he laughed, not unkindly, and said, "You'd be bored in about 4 minutes. Trust me, I've got it handled." I trusted him. That's not a confession. That's just what a marriage is supposed to look like. But there was a Wednesday, about 2 weeks in, when I came home early from the office. A client meeting had canceled, and found Korbin and Morgause at the kitchen table with the accordion file open between them, several documents spread out, and a laptop turned toward them both. They didn't hear me come in. I stood in the hallway for a second longer than I needed to, the way you do when you sense, before you understand, that you've walked into something not meant for you. "Needs her signature eventually," Morgause was saying. "But there's no reason to rush that conversation." "I know how to handle her," Korbin said. And something in the way he said handle made the back of my neck go cold, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Then the floor creaked under me, and they both looked up, and Korbin closed the laptop with a motion so smooth it looked rehearsed. "You're home early," he said, smiling. "Client canceled," I said. "What's all this?" "Insurance stuff," Morgause said, already gathering the papers into a neat stack. "So boring I nearly fell asleep reading it." "You didn't miss anything, dear?" I let it go. I want to be honest about that. I let it go easily, because the alternative was to believe something about my husband and his mother that I wasn't ready to believe. And because Morgause had knelt in the wet grass 2 weeks earlier, and helped me save my father's textbooks without a single complaint. And people who do that aren't supposed to also be the kind of people you need to worry about. That night I lay in bed and looked at my father's letter, still sealed on my nightstand, and for the first time I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. I still didn't open it. I told myself I wasn't ready. I understand now that some part of me already knew I might need it later, and was saving it the way you save anything precious, for when you actually need it, not simply when you want it. The next small thing happened 4 days later, and on its own it would have meant nothing. I came home to find Korbin on a step stool in the living room, hanging a framed photograph of his parents' wedding day, while Morgause stood below him directing with the calm authority of a woman who had never once doubted her own judgment. "A little to the left," she said, and Korbin adjusted it without complaint, the way he always did with her. They were laughing about something I hadn't caught, some small joke between the two of them. And for a moment I just stood in the doorway and watched them, searching their faces, though I couldn't have said for what. There was nothing to find. That's what unsettled me more than if there had been. Korbin turned and caught my eye and gave me that same easy smile that had undone me 12 years earlier, back when I was still raw from my father's funeral, and he'd shown up at exactly the right moments with exactly the right things to say. "You look pale," he said. "Tired," I said. "Long day." Morgause glanced at me then, her eyes lingering half a second too long, the way they sometimes did, as if she were quietly measuring me against some standard I would never quite meet. I'd felt that look before at the wedding, at holidays, at 100 small family dinners. I'd always told myself it was nothing. That night, for the first time, I let myself wonder if it was something. I made an excuse about needing paint for the guest room and drove to the hardware store I didn't need to visit, and I sat in the parking lot for a full minute before I could make myself go inside, because my hands had started shaking and I didn't understand why. I told myself it was nothing. A misunderstanding. Maybe they'd simply been discussing something ordinary. Insurance premiums. A boring detail of settling into a new house. I told myself that, because it was easier than the alternative. But driving home that evening, I thought about my father's habit of reading everything twice, of never trusting a total until he'd checked the individual lines himself. I thought about how easily I had let Korbin take over every piece of paperwork that touched our life, how easily I had let Morgause collect our mail, how comfortable both of them had become in a house that my father's money had made possible. None of it, on its own, would have meant anything. Together, I was starting to understand, it might mean everything. I didn't say anything to Korbin that night. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I let him tell me about a coworker's retirement party. And I laughed at the right moments. And I went to bed early claiming a headache. And I lay in the dark long after I heard him come up the stairs, staring at the ceiling, running back through every small moment of the last 2 weeks like a woman checking a column of figures that wouldn't quite add up. I didn't know yet what I was looking for. I only knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually turns, that I would need to keep looking. Then, for a while, everything got better. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it to excuse what came later. But I want to be honest about how it happened, because that's the part that still catches me sometimes, late at night, more than the betrayal itself. Loyalty doesn't get planted in the good moments. It gets planted in exactly this kind of quiet, ordinary relief. Korbin surprised me on a Friday with reservations at the little Italian place downtown where we'd had our third date, the one with the crooked candle sconces, and the waiter who always remembered we liked the bread basket refilled without asking. He'd taken the afternoon off work. He'd had the tomato starts I'd been wanting delivered to the garden bed out back, already staked and labeled, without my saying a word about it. "I know you've had a lot on your mind," he said, over wine I hadn't finished my glass of yet. "The move, the new job stress, my mother hovering. I want you to know I see it. I want this house to actually feel like yours too." I remember reaching across the table and taking his hand, and meaning it completely. Morgause pulled back that same week, almost as if she'd sensed something in me needed room. She stopped coming by daily. When she did visit, she brought a bottle of wine instead of a tape measure, and she asked about my work instead of the fireplace mantle. And one evening she told me, unprompted, that she thought I'd been good for Korbin in ways his father never managed to be. "He's steadier with you," she said. I noticed things like that. I want you to understand how much I wanted to believe her. I had spent 12 years slowly earning a place in that family, and here, finally, was proof it had worked. That Saturday, I finally opened my father's letter. I sat on the back porch with my coffee, his brass-capped pen resting on the table beside me, and I read 3 pages of his handwriting, careful and small the way he graded every test, telling me things I'd never known. That he'd worried near the end, whether he'd saved enough to give me a real start. That he trusted me to know the difference between people who loved me and people who simply liked what I could offer them. That he'd watched me choose Korbin at the wedding and hadn't been entirely sure, but had decided to trust my judgment the way he'd always trusted my ability to read a column of numbers and know when something didn't add up. "You've always been the one who checks twice," he wrote. "Don't stop, just because you're happy." I folded the letter and held it for a long time before I went back inside. I told myself I was the luckiest woman on Larkspur Lane. Good husband, healed relationship with my mother-in-law. A house my father's money had made possible, finally starting to feel like home. I let my guard down completely. I want to say that plainly, because it matters. I stopped watching the mailbox. I stopped noticing when conversations shifted at the sound of my footsteps. I let Korbin have every folder, every password, every piece of paper that touched our life, because it no longer felt like convenience. It felt like love. I need to take a breath here, because what happened next was a different kind of thing entirely. By the second week of what I'd started thinking of as the good stretch, I had stopped questioning anything. Korbin hummed while he made coffee in the mornings. Morgause brought paint swatches for the guest room now instead of the whole house, and asked my opinion first before offering her own. I photographed the tomato starts every few days, sending them to my father's old email address out of habit, an account I'd never closed, the way some people keep a phone number for a house that's already sold. There's a feeling you get when you've been patient so long that the patience itself starts to feel like a mistake you're finally being rewarded for. I felt that feeling those 2 weeks. I want you to know I felt it completely, because I think it's important you understand I wasn't foolish. I was simply a woman who had been given, after a long stretch of quiet unease, exactly what she'd been hoping for. On a Tuesday afternoon, boxes still lined the hallway from a delivery of new curtains, and the smell of fresh paint from the guest room touch-up still hung faintly in the air. I was in the kitchen unwrapping a stack of wedding china we'd finally decided to unpack, admiring the pattern against the morning light through the window. My phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Mrs. Ashford, this is Whit Sorensen. I sold you the house." I remembered him instantly, a soft-spoken man in his 70s, a retired structural engineer with kind eyes and a slight tremor in his hands when he'd shaken mine at the closing table. He'd lived in that house for 31 years with his late wife, and when he'd handed over the keys, he told me he hoped it would treat me as well as it had treated them. "Mr. Sorensen, is everything all right?" There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I need to apologize for something," he said finally. I set the teacup down on the counter without quite meaning to. "When we set up the smart home system years ago, we installed a security camera in the living room," he said. "I disconnected most of them before the sale. I missed one. It's still linked to my cloud account. I only noticed because I got a storage notification a few days ago, and I went to delete the footage, and he stopped again. "Mrs. Ashford, I think you need to see this yourself." My stomach tightened, though I couldn't have told you why yet. "See what?" "I'd rather not say over the phone. I saved everything to a drive. Please come see me." His voice dropped lower, careful, almost protective. "Alone." Don't say anything to your husband yet. Please. Come alone. I told him I would, and I hung up before I could ask anything else, because my hands had started to shake and I didn't want him to hear it in my voice. I set the phone down on the counter and looked through the doorway into the living room, where Korbin was standing on the step stool again, adjusting the same framed photograph that never quite seemed to hang straight, and Morgause stood below him, laughing softly at something I hadn't caught. There was nothing to see. That's what I told myself one more time, standing in my own kitchen with a teacup in my hand. I grabbed my keys anyway. This is where things stopped being something I could explain away. I told Korbin I was low on paint for the guest room. A lie so smooth and immediate it frightened me a little how easily it came. And I drove toward the other side of town with my heart hammering against my ribs the entire way. Whit Sorensen's new place was a small rental on Cedar Hollow Road. The kind of tidy, quiet house that belongs to a man who has spent his whole life being careful. He opened the door before I even knocked, as though he'd been watching for my car, and the look on his face told me this wasn't going to be the misunderstanding I'd hoped for on the drive over. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would. You made it sound important." "It is." He led me to a small kitchen table where a laptop sat already open, the screen dark, waiting. I sat down, and I noticed my hands were cold despite the warm afternoon, and I folded them together in my lap, so he wouldn't see them trembling. "I want you to understand something first," he said, lowering himself into the chair across from me with the careful movements of a man whose knees had given him trouble for years. "I'm not a man who goes looking for other people's business. I built that camera system myself, mostly for my wife's peace of mind when I traveled for work. When we sold the house, I disconnected every camera I could remember. I missed one, the one behind the bookshelf, wired into an outlet I'd forgotten even existed. I only found out it was still active because my cloud storage sent a notification that it was full." He paused. "I went to delete the footage. Then I watched it. And I couldn't in good conscience delete it without showing you first." "Show me," I said, because I couldn't bear the waiting any longer. He turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The footage was time-stamped from 4 days earlier, a Friday afternoon when I'd been at the office finishing a client file that had kept me late into the evening. The angle was slightly elevated, looking down over the living room. My living room, boxes still stacked along one wall from the curtain delivery. I watched Korbin let himself in through the front door. A moment later, Morgause followed him inside, glancing around the room the way a person looks at something they're already picturing as their own. I watched myself lean forward without meaning to, as though getting closer to the screen might somehow change what I was about to hear. "She still thinks this house belongs to both of you," Morgause said on the recording, settling onto the arm of the sofa, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and steel I'd heard my entire marriage. "Sweet girl. She never even reads the fine print." Korbin laughed. An easy, familiar laugh, the same one I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. "She trusts me," he said. "Why would she read the fine print? I'm her husband." "That trust is useful," Morgause said, "as long as we use it correctly." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a stillness that didn't yet have a name. They kept talking. Morgause mentioned a refinance package, someone she knew personally at a lending office who wouldn't ask too many questions. Korbin mentioned that my father's inheritance had covered nearly 70% of the down payment, and Morgause said it was a shame money like that hadn't gone through proper family channels, that it should have been structured better from the start. They spoke about a power of attorney clause buried somewhere in a stack of documents that would let ownership shift gradually, quietly, legally, without ever requiring a single dramatic confrontation. Morgause said the words over time more than once, savoring them the way you might a recipe that needed patience to come together properly. "She won't notice," Korbin said. "She never notices these things. She trusts me with all of it." I sat frozen at Whit Sorensen's kitchen table, watching my husband describe my trust as a resource to be managed, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that the man who had held my hand at my father's funeral and the man on that screen were somehow, impossibly, the same person. The video ran another 6 minutes. I watched all of it. I watched Morgause walk through my kitchen, opening cabinets, commenting that the layout would suit proper entertaining better once a few walls came down. I watched Korbin nod along to every suggestion, agreeable in the particular way he'd always been agreeable with his mother. A lifelong habit I had once found endearing, because it spoke, I'd thought, of loyalty and love. I understood now that it spoke of something else. Obedience, maybe. Or alliance. When the footage ended, Witt closed the laptop gently, as though closing it too fast might hurt me further. I copied everything onto a drive, he said, sliding a small USB stick across the table toward me. Every angle, every date, everything the camera caught. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, Mrs. Ashford, and it isn't my place to guess. But a house holds people accountable to nothing except what's documented. I thought you should have this before anyone decides to erase what actually happened inside those walls. I picked up the drive and held it in my palm, small and light, barely the weight of a house key. And yet it felt like it might tip the entire foundation of my life. Thank you, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I don't know how to repay this. You don't owe me anything, he said. My wife and I made a home in that house. I'd hate to think of someone taking that same chance away from another family through a lie. He walked me to the door, and just before I stepped out into the fading light, he said one more thing, quietly, almost like a warning. You still have time, Mrs. Ashford. Whatever you decide to do, you still have time to do it right. I drove home with the drive tucked into my coat pocket, my hand resting over it at every red light, as though it might disappear if I let go. And somewhere on that quiet drive back to the house I had paid for with my father's memory, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how deep this went, and exactly how to make sure it could never happen to me, or to anyone else again. I walked back into my own house that evening, and became someone else. Not a different woman exactly. Just a quieter version of myself. One who had learned, in the space of a single afternoon, that the safest place to keep the truth was behind a closed door in my own chest. How was the paint store? Korbin asked, not even looking up from a box of kitchen utensils. Busy, I said. I'll go back tomorrow when it's quieter. He nodded, satisfied. And that was the end of it. I stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching him arrange forks and knives into the drawer organizer I'd bought weeks earlier. And I felt something strange settle over me. Not rage. Not yet. A kind of cold clarity. Like stepping outside on the first frost of the year, and finally being able to see your own breath. Upstairs, before bed, I took my father's letter out from where I'd tucked it back into its box. And I read the line again, the one I hadn't been able to stop thinking about since Cedar Hollow Road. You've always been the one who checks twice. Don't stop, just because you're happy. I picked up his pen off the nightstand and held it for a long time in the dark. I didn't know yet exactly what I would do with it. I only knew I was about to start checking everything, twice. I found Crosby Sinclair's name the way most people find lawyers when they're afraid to ask anyone they know. A late-night search on my phone in bed. The screen brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't wake Korbin beside me. Real estate attorney. 26 years of practice. Reviews that used words like discreet and thorough. I called his office the next morning from the parking lot of the grocery store, my heart pounding as though I were doing something shameful instead of something necessary, and asked for the earliest appointment that didn't require me to explain myself to a receptionist. Crosby's office was small and unglamorous, tucked above a dry cleaner's on a quiet street in Willow Creek, and I liked him immediately for exactly that reason. Nothing about him seemed interested in impressing me. He was maybe 60, gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a man who had seen every version of the story I was about to tell him, and had stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. I brought everything, the USB drive, photographs of documents I hadn't even taken yet but knew I would need, a small voice recorder I'd bought the day before at an electronics store 2 towns over, I set the drive on his desk like evidence at a trial, because in some sense I supposed that's exactly what it was. He watched the footage in silence, occasionally writing something on a legal pad in handwriting too small for me to read upside down. When it ended, he sat back and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Ashford, I want to be direct with you, because I think you'd prefer that to gentleness right now. Please. There's very likely a refinance package coming your way, or already in motion. I'd guess it includes a power of attorney clause buried somewhere in the middle pages. Worded to look like a convenience. Something to streamline future paperwork, so you're not burdened by routine administrative matters. If signed and notarized, it would give your husband broad authority over decisions related to the property. Not immediate total control, but enough scaffolding that over time, with a few more carefully worded documents, he could transfer ownership, borrow against the equity, or sell the property, all without requiring your active participation in each step." I felt my hands tighten in my lap. So it's legal? On its face, yes. That's what makes it dangerous. There's nothing illegal about a spouse asking another spouse to sign paperwork. The law generally assumes that if you sign something, you understood it. Which means the only real protection you have is not signing it, and making very sure they can't quietly force the issue another way. Can they? Not if we move quickly. He tapped his pen against the pad. I can file protective measures today. A notice of interest, updated deed language, a formal record establishing you as the sole party with authority to approve any transfer or encumbrance on the property. It won't stop them from asking you to sign anything, but it will mean that even if you did sign under pressure, any transfer would require your personal verified appearance and separate legal counsel review before it could be finalized. In plain terms, I'm building a wall around the house that only you can open. Relief moved through me so suddenly it was almost dizzying. But underneath it sat something harder. Something that had been growing since the night I first heard Morgause say the words over time on that recording. I want more than a wall, Mr. Sinclair. I want them to understand exactly what they tried to do. I want it documented. I want it undeniable. He studied me for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. A kind of quiet respect. Then we do this carefully, he said. You continue exactly as you have been. Don't refuse to sign. Don't confront them. Let them believe they're close to finishing what they started. The more comfortable they become, the more they'll say. And the more they say, the stronger your position becomes. In the meantime, I file everything necessary to make sure that no matter what happens at that table, nothing actually transfers without going through me first. I left his office that afternoon with carbon copies of every filing he'd promised to submit that week, and I drove home rehearsing, quietly, the version of myself I needed to keep performing. Grateful wife. Trusting wife. A woman slowly, sweetly coming around to signing away a life she didn't yet know was already legally armored against them. I need to pause here, because what I did over the next 2 weeks is the part people ask me about most. So by the end of that stretch, I had photographed every folder in Korbin's home office, forwarded copies to an email account under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, and started carrying a small voice recorder in my cardigan pocket at every family dinner. I want you to understand that none of it felt like triumph while I was doing it. It felt like grief with a job to do. But I need to take a breath here, because what happened next was a different kind of thing entirely. 3 days after my visit to Crosby's office, Korbin came home with a folder of documents and laid them on the dining table with the easy, unbothered manner of a man discussing weekend plans. Refinance paperwork, he said. Nothing exciting. Just cleaning up some of the loan terms now that we've closed. Routine stuff. Morgause, who happened to be there, she seemed always to happen to be there, reached over and patted my hand. Everyone does this after closing, dear. It's boring, but it's just paperwork. You sign a few pages and it's done. I looked at the folder, thick and official, and felt the cold clarity from Cedar Hollow Road harden into something more useful. A plan. Of course, I said, smiling. Let me look it over when I have a quiet evening. I like to actually read things before I sign. You know how I am." Korbin's jaw tightened for half a second. So briefly I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching so closely. "Of course," he said. "No ruse." But there was a rush. I could feel it in the air between them. In the way Morgause's eyes flicked toward Korbin and back to me. The slight practiced patience of two people trying not to seem eager. I asked innocent questions over the following evenings. What does this clause mean? Why is this section highlighted? Is this the standard form the bank uses? Each time, Korbin answered smoothly, confidently, clearly relieved I wasn't pushing harder. He began to relax. He began, I think, to believe his mother had been right about me all along, that I was too trusting, too soft, too in love to ever really look. What he didn't know was that every night after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a soft blue light, going through every page of that folder line by line. I photographed each document with my phone before returning the folder exactly to where he'd left it. It was on the fifth night, reading by the small glow of my screen while Korbin slept upstairs, that I found the clause that changed everything. Buried on page 14, in language so dense it seemed designed to be skipped over, was a provision granting Korbin limited power of attorney over matters related to the property, to be enacted upon my signature and notarized approval. I read it 3 times to be certain I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a refinance. Or rather, it was a refinance wrapped around something else entirely. A legal key that, once turned, would let Korbin make decisions about my house, my father's money, my future, without ever needing to ask me again. I sat very still in the dark kitchen, listening to the old house settle around me, its creaks still unfamiliar after only a few weeks of living there. I thought about my father, about the quiet, careful way he'd saved over 31 years of teaching chemistry to teenagers who mostly didn't care. About how he used to say the surest way to lose something valuable wasn't theft. It was trust, handed to the wrong person, without anyone ever checking where it landed. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since that phone call, I let myself smile, small and grim in the darkness. They thought I was signing away my future. I was about to make sure I never lost it at all. The next 2 days passed in a strange, stretched thin quiet that only I seemed to feel. Korbin hummed while he made coffee in the mornings. Morgause arrived with paint swatches, murmuring about where a sectional might go once we opened up the space a little. As though the walls already belonged to a future she'd already decided on. On a Thursday evening, she mentioned, almost casually, that she knew a notary who could come by the house directly. So much easier than driving somewhere, dear, especially with how busy you've been. I let a beat of hesitation pass. The kind a woman shows when finally letting go of something she'd been holding too tightly. "Monday," I said. "Let's do Monday. I'll have the whole weekend to feel settled about it." Morgause's face lit with something close to triumph. Korbin reached over and squeezed my hand, and I let